Okay. So how does NLP address visual language?
So
it sounds like it's a little different than the direction I'm going with it.
I think there are some similarities there. So NLP focuses, when we talk about visual language in NLP, we're talking about how we as human beings input visual information in. So it starts with our eyes. And then how we convert that into a internal representation. So what kind of like when you close your eyes and you visualize something in your mind's eye, how that is a representation that typically refers to something in the world. So you can remember your first home that you grew up in. As you do that, there's going to be a visual representation in your mind. And depending on how you encode that or how you paint that picture in your mind is going to determine how you feel about it.
Oh, it's like people seeing spiders that are afraid of them. They're going to have this immediate visceral reaction, or snakes or something like that. Whereas somebody who doesn't have that, it's like it's neutral.
Yeah, and one of the fascinating things about it is that the actual way that we, and I'm just going to use metaphorically, the way that we paint the picture in our mind is going to actually determine or have a big influence whether or not we're scared of it, depending on how we create that picture. So, for example, some people who are, people who have a fear of spiders or snakes or any type of a phobia, when they represent the movie in their mind, typically it's very bright. So it's not dim, dark, or black and white.
Oh.
Typically, the things that we represent in our mind that are black and white or a little bit dimmer or darker are going to have less of a visceral reaction on us. And also, one of the interesting things is when we talk about point of view. So someone who has a phobia of spiders, when they imagine one in their mind, typically it's going to be larger than the actual thing. They're going to distort the size of it. And also, typically they're going to, in the memory, it's going to be from the first perspective, looking through their own eyes. Whereas someone who's not afraid or not afraid anymore, someone who's overcome a phobia, is actually going to see themselves from the past in the memory. As opposed to the first position, it's going to be second position. And it's
more like an old movie, in other words, if they don't have that problem.
Exactly. And so it's amazing how, so these are the what I talk about as submodalities in NLP. It's the content stays the same, just like you can have 100 artists paint the same sunset, and every single person is going to have a little bit of a different perspective. Some people are going to make it brighter, use a brighter palette. Some people are going to use a dimmer palette. Some people are going to use a smaller frame. Some people are going to have a wider frame. And so all of these things, although the content, the subject of the image remains the same, depending on how you frame it is going to have a big impact on the emotions that it elicits in somebody, the viewer.
It's so interesting to hear the language that you're using to describe these things. And of course, a lot of these words fit with art. And it's so perfect because it's one of the things I teach is about how you frame things literally as like vertical or horizontal or rectangular or square makes a difference in how people perceive your painting. And there's some crossover, and there's some, so a little bit different stuff, but it's really interesting to compare these kinds of languages. I do that with my husband with writing, because if you study writing, there's so much similarity to the creativity of creating visual art. So there's, communication is communication, I think. When we start looking for the connections, when we look for the similarities, we have more power to communicate on all levels.
100%. And there's a couple things that brings up for me. So one of them is that in NLP, we have a thing called metaprograms, and that's just advanced terminology. It's not so important, but it refers to our thinking patterns, how we filter the world as individuals. And so some people will filter the world one way and other people will be on the opposite side of the spectrum. So one of the ways of filtering the world is looking for sameness. We move through the world and we look, and so throughout this conversation, I actually am consciously putting on a program sorting for sameness. And so people who sort for sameness are going to, if you put $3 bills on the table, the person who sorts for sameness is going to say, yeah, there's $3 bills. Whereas someone who sorts for difference is going to say, well, this one's a little bit dirtier, this one's a little bit newer, that one's a little bit more crumbled. And
Yeah.
so you have two people looking at the same thing, but they're filtering it through these lenses, these metaprograms
Mm-hmm.
they have. And
Yep.
so one of the things that I find is interesting is that, well, you can create very, very fascinating different, it creates different ways of perceiving the world when you sort for sameness and difference. And I think it would be a fascinating experiment for somebody who's a painter or an artist to paint the same scene twice, once looking for similarities and once sorting for differences, and noticing how you would have two completely different creations just by switching your own mental filters. And that's a great
And
creative exercise in and of itself.
absolutely. And it's, you and I have mentioned that in our other correspondence, was that what's fascinating is to see somebody like Monet, who took that to the full limit, where he would paint something 11, 20 times in some cases, and the ones he didn't like he destroyed. But you have some of his examples where there's 11 paintings and they all have 11 different focuses of intention that he wanted to capture, because he saw all the possibilities and he kept looking for all these possibilities and going, no, that can't work in this painting, I got to do it in a different painting. And he would literally carry 11 canvases around with him as the time of day changed.
Amazing.
And
yeah, and one of the other presuppositions from NLP is that everything is process. So nothing, there is no things. There's only beingness or movement in the world. And so with that, if you take that out to its fullest, it's like you could never look at the same thing twice, and no two people can look at the same thing the same way.
mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, if that doesn't get your creative juices flowing, right?
Well, I hope so. That's the idea, is to help people see more possibilities, because one of the things that happens with a painter is sometimes boredom will kick in. They've lost their stimulus for doing the painting in the first place, and I think that's losing their original idea, or never really fully forming it, or getting to a point where it just seems so stuck. They don't know how to progress.
Yeah.
So so sometimes you have to regroup and sit back and just get relaxed with it and say, okay, what are the possibilities here? And if you can see more possibilities, it starts to become fascinating again.
100%, 100%. And so there's a couple of things that brings up. One of the things is again, like you said, creating as many possibilities as you can. And there's a quote from Abraham Maslow, who's the father of self-actualization psychology, that he says the ultimate form of creativity is being creative in how you perceive the world. And so part of it is, most people think of creativity as in kind of the artistic expression, but there's the internal creativity that comes before the external innovation or creativity. There's two parts of creativity. You have to create on the inside and then create on the outside. And so, like you said, yeah, being very creative and generating as many possibilities as you can be really helpful. Also in NLP, to continue on that, one of the amazing contributions of NLP to NLP by a man named Robert Dilts was that, like I said in the beginning of this conversation, we can use NLP to model what experts do, and so that other people can replicate it. And so what Robert Dilts did was he actually modeled out the creativity strategy of Walt Disney, which was really fascinating. And it ties in with this because, well, the place where it starts is one of the major inhibitors of creativity is people bringing out their internal critic too soon.
Yes, absolutely.
And so they have an idea and then they judge it. And then they have an idea and they judge it. And they have an idea and they judge it. And what that does is it's like slamming on the gas and pushing on the brake at the same time. You're not opening up the channel of creative flow and getting those juices moving.
Yeah, that's what writers who don't realize that creative writing is about just getting it out and just letting it go and go and go, and forget about commas or capitalizations or anything. It doesn't matter. Get that out and just put it on the paper. Hemingway had something succinct to say about that. He said, vomit it on the page and clean it up later. A little bit rude, but boy, it is the way it is.
I like that quote. That's a good one. And it's a really great, it's kind of like great sage advice that most people, what they modeled from Walt Disney was that he had actually 3 distinct states that he would go into, and you could actually see
Oh,
that he would even behave differently in these different states. So the
wow.
first state was that he had the dreamer state. And in the
Mm,
dreamer state would be this, like we're talking about now, it's like unlimited possibilities, brainstorming, getting out as much as possible, no judgment,
hmm.
just like
Yeah.
dreaming and dreaming and dreaming and dreaming and dreaming and dreaming. And some of those things would be crazy or absurd or unrealistic, and it didn't matter, right? It's just get as
Yeah.
much out as a brain dump, vomit it out onto the paper.
Yeah.
And after that process was completely finished, he would then step into the critic state
Or the discernment.
and start evaluating some of the stuff. But one of the genius parts of it was actually separating those states in yourself, so
Hmm.
that we're not at the same place at the same time. And even we can do that by changing our location in our house. Where do we sit when we dream, and where do we
Ah.
sit when we are in our discernment phase? And if we actually even spatially separate that out, that's something that Aldous Huxley would do when he was writing. Is he would have his flow chair, his genius chair, and when he would sit in that chair, someone could be ringing on the doorbell, knocking on the door, walking in the room, and he wouldn't even notice they were there because he was in his creative flow state in that space. So that's another way we can
Hmm.
creatively use space, actually in our physical environment, to
Cool.
enhance creativity.
Cool.